All right, that keynote started right on time, so I think I'm gonna try and keep that going as well. Can I get just any indication that my audio is coming through before I get started? Excellent. Thanks, Steve. Um, wow, I have a lot of tabs open from the chat window on that other session, so I'm looking forward to going back through that. And I'm also pleased that um, a lot of what was talked about kind of dovetails into what I'm hoping to talk about. So. Um, Good afternoon, or whatever time it is wherever you are. My name is Paul Pival, and I'm a librarian at the library at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. That's a little bit above Montana, just a little bit to the east of the Rockies, and you may send your condolences because winter has returned with a vengeance. We were at about 60 degrees on the weekend, and now we're down at about 14 degrees Fahrenheit with almost a foot of snow. So, yay. Um, this session is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. I'll also be providing a link to the slides somewhere along the way. But I'm also going to be pasting some links into the chat box during my talk. And if y'all would be so kind as to respond on my behalf to the latecomers who ask those same questions, I'd really appreciate it. We should have some time towards the end to have a bit of a discussion. But if we don't, for some reason or another, you can email me, and you can always find me in any of the finer social networks as PPVol. So thanks again to San Jose State University. And I would like to take this opportunity to quickly acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, located in the heart of southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Personally, I always find it fascinating to hear the land acknowledgements from around the world, or at least around North America, so I hope you do as well. So I actually had some semantic issues as I was putting together this proposal and presentation. What I had been calling in my head a framework turned out during my research to actually be something else. I actually came here to talk about a list of competencies, which were mentioned in the proposal. So I suspect you're okay and you're still in the right place. I just want to be clear that I'm not actually going to be talking about a framework. Frameworks come after competencies. According to an AI I consulted, a framework is like a blueprint for building a house. Competencies would be like a shopping list of materials needed to build the house, and the framework tells you how to put those materials together to build the final structure. I know it's not a perfect analogy, but keep that in mind for the next few slides. Fortunately, the ACRL framework for information literacy that's been around for a number of years, the framework for information literacy specifically in higher education, is in fact broad enough to cover generative artificial intelligence, as Amy James and Ellen Filgo have demonstrated in their excellent ACRL news article. And I'll be giving you the link to that in just a moment. In addition, he did get a chance to mention it just towards the end. One of our opening keynote speakers this morning, or this afternoon rather, Dr. Leo Lowe, he's spearheading an initiative within ACRL to actually update the existing framework to explicitly address generative AI. And that's a project you should keep an eye on. And again, I'll give you a link to that as well. So keep some of the following in mind when we hit my list of competencies, and we'll see how they fit into this framework. So we've got 6 frames in the framework. Authority is both constructed and contextual. Students need to develop awareness of the importance of assessing content with a skeptical stance and with a self-awareness of their own biases and worldview that comes from that frame. Information creation as a process. Do you know how large language models work? Can you accept the ambiguity surrounding the potential value of information creation expressed in emerging formats or modes? Third one, information has value. Are you comfortable citing information, acknowledging the value provided to you by a chatbot? This was something that was addressed or showed up at least in the chat window in the morning session or the earlier session. I'm going to keep calling it the morning session. Forgive me for that. The opening keynote is what I'm referring to there. And can you verify the accuracy of any citations the chatbot might provide, if any? Research as inquiry. Can you work with or use a chatbot to break down complex problems? Scholarship as conversation. This one's easy. Remember that most generative AI tools aren't search engines. They're simply not. They're chatbots. So remember to always have a conversation with these things. Don't just give it a one shot. And then finally, searching as a strategic exploration. Searching, as we all know, is nonlinear and iterative, and generative AI tools, at least in the foreseeable future, they're not going to completely supplant academic databases. We know this. So remember that. Remind your users that there's still an awful lot of value in the academic databases that are made available in each of our libraries. So let me give you these links. There we go. So as I mentioned, because I was initially a little bit confused about whether I was talking about frameworks or competencies, I'd actually collected these links, which are at the higher framework level, and they're definitely still worth checking out. Within the toolkit and the sandbox links, you'll find content that your colleagues, other librarians, have built that will help you understand and incorporate generative AI into your existing lesson plans. The ACRL news article I mentioned is starred towards the bottom, and the work that Dr. Lowe is doing is in that final link that takes you out to an ACRL website, which kind of outlines the task force that he has proposed. And from everything I've heard and understood, it's a go. It's just kind of waiting to get rolling. So there will be updates, it seems, to the ACRL framework for information literacy. But let's talk about what I actually think we all need to know at a minimum in order to deal with generative AI in our profession, and thus to be able to help our patrons use this technology as well. So this is the list of competencies that I'm proposing as the bare minimum we should all have in this profession. I started writing LLMs as large language models, but I'm coming around to the idea of putting these all in the bucket of generative AI or Gen AI. It was in a presentation just a couple of weeks ago where it was only referred to as Gen AI. And I think I've been resisting that terminology because I keep reading it as generation AI. In fact, I wasn't actually sure what the current generation was being called these days, but Perplexity tells me it's Generation Alpha, and those are people born between 2010 and 2024. And who knows, maybe Gen AI will in fact be what we call the kids born after 2024. I actually think this technology may prove to be significant enough for that to stick. And if so, maybe you heard it here first. But whenever I say or write LLM in one of these slides, feel free to swap in Gen AI if that's how you're thinking of this space. And I may flip back and forth between LLM, Gen AI, and generative AI. But in this context, they're all the same thing. What I'd like you to consider is how do each of these four competencies differ from what we might have learned about back in library school when learning how to use a bibliographic database. Traditional bibliographic databases seem to me an awful lot easier to understand, and they're not built on the same kind of fast-moving quicksand that generative AI tools are. So, competency number one, How do large language models, or Gen AI, work? Heard this name, or it was mentioned in the chat box at the very least, but I think somebody actually spoke it as well. But Ethan Mollick, a professor at Wharton in Pennsylvania, who is an expert in the use and evaluation of generative AI models, recently stated that he believes there are currently 3 front-running, or what he calls frontier models in this space. And I think we, as professionals, need to be familiar with all of them. Furthermore, he reckons that it takes at least 10 hours of use with each of these models before one can be even reasonably proficient with their nuances. The 3 frontier models are GPT-4, not 3.5, which is what's available for free on OpenAI's chat tool. So GPT-4, which is accessible through OpenAI's ChatGPT Plus, or as Dr. Lowe had mentioned, it's also available via Microsoft Copilot, at least if you're using creative mode. So that's the first model, the first frontier model. The second one is Google's Gemini 1.0 Ultra. Great name. And most recently, and again, this was mentioned, Anthropic's Claude 3 Opus. So at the most basic, I think, only knowing about ChatGPT, especially at, say, the 3.5 level, it's analogous to only knowing about Gale Academic OneFile. Yeah, you'll be able to figure out the interfaces for EBSCO and Ovid and the rest. But as an information professional, you really should be more fluent than being able to figure something out on the fly. Not to mention, there are nuances to each of these things, and some of them definitely do offer features that others don't. Some of these tools will be much more appropriate in certain information situations. So that's something that we all do need to know about. This also showed up in the chat window as the keynote session was going by, but one of the major disadvantages to us, though, is that aside from the free access through Microsoft Copilot, currently free at least, all of these require a paid subscription. And subscribing to each of these, or all of these, certainly all of these, is definitely beyond the means of most of us. Maybe in the future, this is the sort of thing that our employers will have to cover, either directly within the library for librarians, or possibly as a campus subscription. I know that there are at least a few academic institutions out there that have started to dabble with this, but I think it's probably going to start to become more common. Or maybe as information professionals, we'll find them essential enough to start to have to forego our lunches. And I hope that doesn't come to that. But and our students are likely poorer than we are. So is it fair that they don't have easy access to these frontier models? It's another instance, as was mentioned, of a digital divide. Yet another disadvantage, not as obvious to those of you in the United States, but these things are not universally available geographically. Here in Canada, we just got access to Google's Gemini a couple of weeks ago, and technically, legally, we don't have access at all to Claude 3 Opus. I can get to it using a VPN, but sitting in Canada, I don't have access to it. So going back to that estimate of 10 hours to become reasonably proficient with each of these models, I certainly can only claim proficiency with GPT-4 so far, but not the others. And maybe for me, that's okay if my clients don't have access to these models, but they're all going to come. And I know certainly that I do need to become proficient in, at the very least, these 3 frontier models, if not all of the other ones that are out there. For the second competency, and incidentally, I have the chat box open, but I'm not going to even attempt to be reading it as it goes by. So if you're asking questions in there, towards the end, I'll try and swing back through and pick them up, but I'm not going to be responding to anything that does pop in there as we go. So for the second competency, we need to be very aware of how these things are biased based both on the data upon which they've been trained, but also in the programming behind them. As I hope you know, these generative AI models, large language models, have been trained more or less on as much of the content of the internet as each of their respective companies can scrape. And as we all know, many of the corners that have been scraped are not what we might consider very clean. Every single slur, prejudice, stereotype, or conspiracy theory that you can think of resides somewhere in the brain of each and every one of these models, even and especially the frontier models. Um, and every one of those things could pop out at any time. So don't accept a response from a generative AI tool without stopping to consider that at the very least. Just kind of make it a reflexive habit. But in addition to the content that's been well documented, it seems pretty well known. But in addition to that content, we also need to remember that every single one of these frontier models and the rest, they were programmed by what we now colloquially call Silicon Valley tech bros. They look an awful lot like me, just a lot younger. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that group of people, it is becoming increasingly clear and obvious that they don't accurately represent or possibly even understand the rest of the world. Yet, generative AI brains have mostly been trained how to think and respond by that one homogeneous group. When it's pointed out that maybe they should consider other worldviews, they sometimes can swing a little bit too far in the other direction. I double checked this morning, and Google Gemini still is refusing to create pictures after the whole woke picture fiasco that happened a couple of weeks ago. If somehow that escaped your notice, definitely look it up. It's really fascinating. There have also been reports of mainstream media blocking content crawlers from generative AI companies, yet right-wing media continuing to allow that content to be scraped. So there's another training data set issue to be aware of. Also, consider that eventually generative AI will increasingly be trained on content that was originally generated by generative AI. What the hell is that going to mean? Again, in the chat box during the keynote session, there was an awful lot of back and forth about kind of observations that Google itself has really started to not be great, certainly not as good as it used to be as far as a search engine. And I wonder if this is kind of the tip of that iceberg. Is that one of the reasons that that is occurring? Moving on to competency number 3. What are hallucinations in this context? And this, I think, is one of the most basic things we as librarians need to be aware of before teaching our users about these tools. Surely you're already aware that general purpose generative AI chatbots will happily make up legitimate looking citations to academic literature that flat out doesn't exist. Even when you push back and ask for clarification, ChatGPT, especially in my experience, will swear up and down that it's really, really real. Personally, I found Copilot to be a little bit better in this regard, but it's definitely not perfect. I've read that this is actually going to prove to be one of the hardest problems to completely solve with generative AI. So again, just kind of tuck that away in the back of your mind as you're using these tools and considering them. Aside from fake citations, of course, chatbots have also been known to completely make up facts from time to time. And this really isn't an issue we've ever had to consider or worry about when using Academic Search Premier. There is a technology that can help with both of these types of hallucinations, at least just a little bit. So you should, if you're not already, you should familiarize yourself with the concept of this thing called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. In a very small nutshell, RAG is when a domain-specific body of knowledge gets inserted between a request and the answer that's generated from a large language model. So for instance, here at the University of Calgary, we have an AI chatbot in the library. It's powered by IV.ai, hashtag not sponsored. But it does work well. It has been introduced to or fine-tuned on the content of all of our library's websites, LibGuides, and FAQs. Whenever that chatbot is asked a question, it first consults with what it knows from that knowledge base, and then proceeds to generate an answer. The way it behaves and responds, so the generation is still general large language model territory, but the specific knowledge that it provides almost exclusively comes from the part where it's retrieved data from our local websites. So there's an example of retrieval augmented generation, and it has proven to reduce, not just in our setting, but generally, it has proven to reduce, though not completely eliminate, the number of hallucinations that are generated. And I should point out that that training on any of our content is continuous. It scrapes just as any other search engine bot might do. So if and when we change an FAQ, it gets updated. We recently implemented a live kind of density of users within the library, and that RAG-oriented chatbot is able to access that kind of current information as well. It's pretty amazing. When we start to see more traditional bibliographic databases offer AI chatbots, so things like Scopus AI, accessing and using content from Science Direct, I think they're one of the first ones out of the gate, they are going to be using RAG type chatbots. The way they talk will depend on how they've been trained by the tech bros, but the knowledge that they provide to you will be primarily from the underlying bibliographic databases they're retrieving from. So that's RAG. Be aware of it, pay attention, ask about it. It ought to help, at the very least, with the hallucination side. So on to the final competency that I would like to propose, and it's a big one. It's ethics. Again, lots and lots of mention and chat in the chat box during the keynote session. This seems so new in library land, doesn't it? Until now, with the exception of maybe one vendor, you'd never consider ethics when deciding which product to buy to serve your clientele. You'd trust that whatever EBSCO or ProQuest were selling you had been honestly produced, that the content was obtained legally, and that megawatts of electricity didn't go into the generation of the database, let alone get burned each time you actually ran a query. But even more likely, you probably wouldn't have even given any of those factors even a first thought. But each of those are things you should at least be aware of when deciding to use a generative AI tool. Honestly, I doubt I'll stop using these things, even as I read how energy and water intensive their use is. But I do think, honestly, that all other things being equal, I would choose to use one model over another if somebody came up with a way to provide me with results that they could demonstrate left the planet for my grandchildren. Copyright is a whole other issue, again, addressed in the opening keynote. Because it's a legal construct, the rules and laws are different in different countries. And I'm not prepared to touch that one with a 10-foot pole, but I'm sure glad other people are thinking about it. I actually recently became aware that some content providers like Harvard Business Review are now explicitly prohibiting end users from uploading content into a large language model based chatbot. They don't want that content to be part of the brain. There's been some discussion, quite a bit, I'm sure. I'm aware of some discussion around how open access journals and the whole idea there might be problematic, because that type of content has been scraped, and maybe the vendors no longer want that. So keep an eye on that. There are reports that people in third world countries are essentially being exploited during the initial training of some of these generative AI models. They spend long hours interacting with questionable graphic and harmful content just so we don't have to see it when we use the tools. And that's not a good thing. And again, it's not something we've ever really had to deal with or consider when shopping for or using traditional library databases. And on the horizon, disinformation. Um, there's ethics behind that as well. That's a topic that is going to deserve its own presentation. So in conclusion, I presented you with a bare bones list of the basic things I think we should all know about generative AI as information professionals. These competencies can fit within our existing information literacy frameworks, but we definitely need to educate ourselves before we're able to decide how to incorporate these tools into our everyday workflow and instruction sessions. This last slide is a list of places you can start to learn more. You probably already have a fair bit of knowledge, but there are some good spots here. And I pasted the links into the chat box just now as well. And again, a lot of these were mentioned in the keynote session as well. So AI literacy, it's not a static concept. It evolves with the advancement of AI technologies. And as generative AI becomes more sophisticated and its applications more diverse, the definition of AI literacy will likely continue to expand. It will involve understanding new AI technologies, their applications, their implications. Continuous learning and adaptability will be the key to our staying AI literate in the future. As a profession, our use of AI tools is currently unclear, emerging, and uneven. So let's come to a consensus on a solid foundation to build upon. Thanks for your time. I'm happy to try and take any questions, but it looks like we got 3 minutes to go till the next one. So track me down online, and I'll see you in the chat boxes on the rest. Thank you.